You guys have built the biggest and most luxurious condos you can think of down here in South Florida.
We live on a coral reef, basically. It's limestone. If you built these massive buildings on that, it would move, literally. Many studies have shown that over the last 50 years, productivity has actually been 0% increase, right? It's been flat. So we're seeing stronger storms form much faster.
The Aston Martin building, 100 stories.
These are vertical cities, right? That building is actually structurally hung from the top down. And that's why there's no columns there. And that's how you get that great aesthetic. South Florida is very transient. So you have a workforce that's sort of in and out here constantly. To the extent that we can make this community more livable for everybody, including that workforce, then they're going to continue to grow and prosper in this community.
How do these buildings get built? How does that work? If you've been wondering how buildings get built down here in South Florida, the process, new construction, we have a good podcast for you today. This is the Better Decisions Podcast, and I am David Siddons, your host. And today I have the pleasure of sitting here with Patrick Murphy from Coastal Construction. Patrick, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, David.
We're going to dig into the new condo construction process. I know you guys build a lot, and it's not just condos, but you're involved in a lot of different things. But you are a huge, huge player down here in South Florida. I'd love you to just, for those who don't know, introduce yourself, just to kind of like frame this, and then tell us a little bit about Coastal, what you guys do, and then we're going to dive into the questions.
All right, sounds good. Yeah.
Awesome.
And thank you again for having me on.
It's a pleasure.
Patrick Murphy, as you mentioned, I was raised in a family construction business called Coastal Construction. My grandfather was a painter. After World War II, he was a paratrooper, so he wasn't afraid of heights. So he was painting radio towers and moved to Key West in the early 1950s. And so my dad grew up around construction, around the trades. And my dad started his career really at University of Miami. He was a freshman at University of Miami, and he rebuilt the Pike House that he was living in, the frat house. He made, couple bucks, like 10 grand. He thought he was the richest guy in the world.
He was at college.
At college.
Wow.
And he dropped out of school, and he said, I'm making so much money. Why would I keep, staying in school? So he basically dropped out and had to support his family and, young family at the time. And he started a construction company. And his, from the very beginning, it was always about quality, number one, and relationships and trust, right? That's really his whole career. And, old school of hard knocks. He was a union laborer, union carpenter, right? Learned the basics and the foundations really well. And that's what he instilled in my brothers and I. My two brothers now are co-presidents of Coastal. Yes. I think we've got 10 to 12 family members in the business.
Yeah,
now
it's a big
Coastal.
Family. Looking at your profile, I know your brother Sean. I've met him, and it's a clan, isn't it?
It's a clan. And so anyway, my dad was blessed to get a couple big breaks in his life. One of those was moving to Ocean Reef Club in 1978 or so to build the club, and he got exposed to some of the most high end sort of real estate expectations at the time, and again doubled down on learning about quality construction.
And this is This is Ocean Reef down in the towards the Keys.
In the Keys, yes.
Yeah, which is a super luxury project. Even today, you try and buy into that. That's like right up.
I wish we would have kept all of our real estate there. but anyway, so had some great breaks, and then after Hurricane Andrew, the company grew quite a bit. That hit, of course, here in South Florida. And we were living down in the Keys then. And that's when the sort of mid-rise, high-rise movement really started in South Florida, was that sort of mid-90s, late 90s. And we came to Miami, started doing some of those mid-rises. One of the big jobs we did was called Deering Bay.
Yes.
Another great community here in South Florida. And from there, we've just been able to ride this great wave here in South Florida and have some great clients and a wonderful team that have helped us excel.
And the business, to be clear, Coastal, you guys are you're behind major projects. So just for those who want to know, the biggest and most luxurious condos you can think of down here in South Florida, just to reel off a few, you guys have built Four Seasons Surfside. Let's start with that. It's the most successful, highest dollar per square foot project in South Florida. You've built both Oceanas, both on Bal Harbour and Key Biscayne, again, ultra luxury project. You've built Armani up in Sunny Isles. You've built Porsche up in Sunny Isles. You're building Bentley right now. You've built St. Regis, which is obviously a very well-established project. The list seems to go on and on. I mean, these are the top
Fisher
tier.
Island, Faena, up in Palm Beach have some great jobs.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Faena, of course. I mean, huge project. Fisher Island again. I mean, this is ultra luxury. And this is obviously, as the city expands and develops, kind of getting into it, as we're expanding, how are we handling? I mean, how is the city handling this expansion? How are you handling this expansion?
For those of us that live here and are from here, I think we see it every day. We feel the pain every day, right? With the traffic, with the congestion. Yeah. But look, there's pros and cons, right? I mean, there's a lot of upside to that. With that is coming a lot new restaurants and better restaurants, right? With that's coming more art and sciences and diversifying our economy, which was so reliant on tourism and real estate. Now we have a tech scene, right? We've got healthcare, right? We're continuing to broaden out more into finance, right? You've got the Citadel headquarters coming down, and so
you build commercial. Obviously, you're building commercial as well.
We have 4 offices, high-rise offices going up right now.
What are you building right now, commercially speaking?
So we just finishing one Flagler that's related Steve Ross's office up in Palm Beach.
Yes, that's a big one.
That's I think HQ2.
How many square feet are we talking? Let's run through those and give me the amount of, so people can understand the scale of this.
Yeah, don't quote me, but most of our offices are 30 to 50 stories. It's a big range, but there's somewhere in that range. Some of them are mixed use. We're doing one on 26 and Biscayne, and that is 150,000 square feet of office with 399 apartments above it, with some retail on the ground floor. So you see some of that mixed use. In downtown, we're looking at a couple other pretty big offices, a couple big banks. You've probably read about Santander and some other ones.
That's an impressive, I mean, the renderings on that, wow.
Yes, some really exciting offices being discussed. So, hopefully it keeps going and businesses and people keep moving to South Florida, because that's continuing to fuel our economy.
So, just before the camera started rolling, I asked you, I think, a question that most people think when they think of building a building, which is, how the hell do you do it? Because it's such an abstract concept to think about. 1 minute there's an old building, then there's a piece of empty lot, and then there's this skyscraper coming up in front. How's the process? I don't know if you can walk through quickly, it's even possible, to kind of, how do these buildings get built? How does that work?
It's a great question. It is a mystery to most. Number one, it starts with pre-construction. There is a year or 2 to 3 easily that goes into these jobs before they're built. So there's a lot of time and effort, from the acquisition of the land to the planning, the schematic of the building, to then getting more into the construction documents and those details. Then, of course, into the approvals, which could easily be a year or so.
Yeah.
And while that's happening, the construction teams are organizing and trying to plan how they're going to build it, right? Every detail, the timing of the columns and the beams and the finishes and the subs and the garbage trucks and the cranes, right? All of this stuff is being organized. And then, of course, you are surprised with delays or hurricanes or XYZ, a pandemic, right? You just never know what's around the next corner. So you have to be able to move and adjust to these situations. But basically, once you get through that pre-construction planning, you've got your subcontractors lined up, you've got a budget lined up, you've got a schedule lined up. So in a lot of the condos that we just discussed, you've got 6 to 12 months of underground work that happens, right? You've got piles going down 150.
Yeah, because people don't see stuff when you go into a building site. They're like, is anything happening?
Right.
But there's stuff going on.
And that's the foundation of the building. And the where we live is unique. We live on a coral reef, basically. It's limestone. If you built these massive buildings on that, it would move, literally, right? So what we do is we build these piles. We drill these piles that go down to the bedrock here.
Yeah, huge rods that go.
Huge rods. Yeah, basically it's the rebar and grout that gets put into these piles.
How deep do these go? How deep are these?
150. Almost 200 feet in some circumstances, depending on the width of the building and the height of the building. Yeah,
and obviously we're getting into taller and taller buildings.
Yes.
I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday, the Aston Martin building, 100 stories.
Right.
I mean, I'm just thinking of physics, just simple physics.
Yeah, the Waldorf, going up 1,000 feet.
Yes,
and there's numerous 1,000-foot buildings that we're looking at now that are in the market. And that's never, we never had anything like that in South Florida, right? You mean the Four Seasons, you had, a couple Panorama, a couple big buildings, but it's really going to the next caliber.
Yeah, I was having a conversation a while back. It just reminded me with Craig Studnicki, and he said, it's one thing to build a building of 35 stories. It's a whole other game. Once you go above that, the logistics and the time it takes is really complicated.
Yeah, I mean, these are vertical cities, right? So your mechanical systems, right? Your plumbing, your pumps, your electrical systems and generators, and of course, all the way down to the foundation. There's a lot more complexity that goes into this. And just like any city, we're going through a growth sort of pattern here where the engineers maybe that we're used to building 35-story buildings, all of a sudden doing 100-story buildings. It's a big deal, right? So oftentimes relying on folks in New York and Chicago and other cities that have done this regularly to work with our local, teams here. And same thing on the construction side and architectural side. Yeah,
we forget these are almost, I say, living, breathing things. It's almost like an organism. You've got within it, you've got waste coming out of the building. Mm-hmm. You've got trash coming down trash chutes. Mm-hmm. You've got the core of the building, you've got elevators, you've got workers, you've got the environment. I mean, there's so much that goes into it. You've got changing environment around the buildings, like traffic flows. Like with the buildings with this rapid expansion and all these projects, right now you've got a track record of having built a lot of projects. What would you say that the most valuable things that have been learned in the projects that you've done up till date, thinking about the luxury ones?
Yeah, great question. Number one, it's always about relationships. It's always about trust and working closely with the design team and your client. And sometimes expectations change, right? Sometimes it's the market's changing. So we have to be ready to evolve with that client and work with them, be transparent in our pricing and work with the subcontractors to make sure any potential changes that they are asking for are recognized, right?
Yeah.
As it comes to the construction, side of it, waterproofing is a constant sort of learning experience in South Florida and things that we've learned over the last 30 years.
Explain waterproofing. What do you mean by that?
Just so if you were, I'm not going to pick on someone, but if you were a contractor maybe from the north, you'd come down with a certain waterproofing detail that might work in the New England area, say, but you come here to South Florida and it's not going to work, right? Our climate is very different, right? The way our buildings breathe, literally, whether the air is coming in or coming out, is opposite here, right? Because of the humidity levels that we have. So the exhaust systems change, right? The mechanical systems have to be very different here. The waterproofing details, because of the rain that we get, the just sheer amount of rain with the wind combined, you have rain and water penetrating in areas that you would never imagine. So you have to be very diligent on your waterproofing, your drains, those kind of details.
Yeah, these buildings, they always look amazing in renderings. I mean, every developer, they build a beautiful building, but the realities of, and again, the environment, and again, looking at rain, we constantly see one of the biggest challenges as buildings get older, and this leads in, there's a cascading effect down from, there's a little bit of water intrusion, and then that leads to, repair that needs to happen, and that can lead to assessments, and that can lead to additional costs, and that can lead to closed terraces, and over time, over years, you see how some buildings 10, 15 years on, 20 years on, still operate well.
Yes.
You did St. Regis up in Bal Harbour, still a successful building in terms of selling, still well done. But other buildings the same age, they look 20 years older. They're I say degrading, they're just breaking apart. They're needing a lot more maintenance.
A couple things to add here. Number one, we have a quality QA QC team headed up by my Uncle Mike. He's been in the industry for decades and basically has taken those decades of experience into a program that we walk the job under construction, and sort of post-construction to make sure that every detail that we've learned over 30, 40 years building condos in South Florida has been, paid attention to. We also bring this up in the pre-construction phase to make sure that our clients and developers know, hey, these are the way we're going to do things, because we need a building that's going to last, that's timeless here. And so we need to make sure that's in the budget from Jump Street. Number two is the actual maintenance of these buildings, right? Sometimes, corners get cut once we've delivered the job and the budget's not there. You have to make sure that there's a real maintenance program. And then number three is an architectural team, a local team that knows the environment here, that certain details are not going to hold up because of the rain, whatever various elements that we have to deal with here. And so, while it's great to have some of these big name, architects and all from out of town, we always prefer they team up with some local people that know the nuance of a building that's going to last and not age.
Yeah. So is there architectural maintenance almost that you're getting into? Because we see obviously the exterior design, the interior functioning element and the changing elements within the building. mean that kind of like just if you did on your own house. I know, for example, you can suddenly realize that, hold on, airflow into this room isn't as effective because, you know, maybe this room's getting hotter for various different reasons. It's a moving goalpost, so to speak.
100%. These are all big calculations. If you're living on the ocean versus if you're inland, right, where the building sits, is it, you know, more sun exposure or less, right? All of these factors have a really big, you know, play. Are you next to other buildings? So there's a lot of considerations. The unique piece that we talked about earlier was that each of these buildings is unique.
Yes.
Right. And so it's not like you just build, you know, 10 of the same building. You can keep tweaking it and improving it. They're all one of a kind. They've never been done before. Right. Which is part of why that pre-construction phase takes so long, and the budgeting, planning is so important. But architects, designers, contractors, they're all learning, right, as we build these and say, ooh, that detail didn't work. You know, the AC was maybe too close to that balcony door that's always open and created some extra condensation that's always dripping on the wood floor that's now, doesn't look as good as it when it was built, right? Whatever the detail is, that people constantly are learning.
So when you're in the construction process, you're sitting down with the architects, and there's probably internal architects as well who are in the process of, I'm thinking internal architecture is very different to external architecture, like where you put the vents and all that kind of stuff. This is very like subtle nuances. If we were to be able to take Uncle Mike and you and put you in front of, like, let's say a buyer's walking around looking like, I've got a typical client. Okay, right. He's going to buy a $10 or $20 million condo. Let's say $20 million condo. And he's like, I'm trying to figure out what I should buy. What do I have to pay attention to? What are the things that Uncle Mike would say, yeah, you want to check this? Can you give me an examples of things that you've noticed in this process that you've said, all right, you've got to be careful of? And
you might not sell a single unit, David, if we did that with your clients.
Really?
No, I'm exaggerating, but there are so many details to look out for, and it's sort of a slippery slope, right? And you can't prepare or think through every circumstance. But look, obviously, it starts with the structure of the building. It starts with the parking garage. Is it above ground, below ground, right? As we've seen with water and flooding, and you know, I think that's obvious for those that live here. But it starts there. I think amenities are important, where they're at, you know, are they easy to get to, traffic flows. Yeah. And then once you get into the building, elevators, lobbies, enough elevators, right? Is there, are they going to be waiting on the elevator lobby for 10 minutes, or is it going to be right there? Your balconies, are they glass balconies or, you know, something else? The glass balconies are a lot of maintenance. Yep. Wood floors, of course, in South Florida they're beautiful, of course, but they're much tougher to maintain because of the moisture. Yep. We don't have a lot of days where you can really open up your balcony and have fresh air through. Going from a building that is typically air conditioned, that is dehumidified, right, almost by definition, to then opening up your doors and letting all that humidity in can cause all sorts of impacts for really, really high-end finishes, right? So you'll start to see cracking. That's not necessarily a construction thing. That's just life living in a swamp, right? That's just the reality of where we live. The location of the AC, you know, vents, of course, is important to note for condensation, maintenance, and just aesthetics. Where the mechanical systems are that easy to get to. If you have a high-end unit, you probably don't want someone coming in and out of your unit, you know, all the time to change filters and pumps and that sort of thing. So having a mechanical room with a separate entrance, perhaps a separate, elevator shaft or stairs is important. You know, the systems we use and we recommend, whether it's the cabinets, whether it's the electronics, or whether it's the dishwashers and sinks and, you know, the various appliances packages that we recommend. We usually try to stick to our guns with certain vendors that we just don't like because we've had so many problems with them, and so many maybe styles of, you know, a certain, you know, a version of a certain, you know, product was really, really bad, and it might be cheaper for a reason. So we try to bring our experience to our clients and say, hey, when you do it like this, there's going to be a problem long term. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, we always, I mean, it's that classic saying, the cheap becomes expensive. Yep. And we've seen it before where we've seen projects, and without naming names, one of the challenges that I've sat with clients is sometimes, you know, these buildings get complicated. Mm-hmm. and sometimes they get overly complicated. There's too much to offer. There's too many moving parts, and these need maintenance. These need things. It's like having a supercar. You've got to keep tweaking the thing every 5 seconds because it's tuned to such a level, and it offers so much, and it performs to such a high level, and that gets difficult. It's like owning a Ferrari. It's like, I know friends who have them, and they're constantly having to get them tweaked and in the shop. Obviously, one of the things I wanted to get into was the current challenges that we're dealing with, and that kind of leads into a lot of other facets. But one of the things I noticed was buildings now are doing the exteriors, the terraces, the lips slightly differently. They're wrapping them in metal. There's a few buildings like, I don't know, Mandarin Oriental comes to mind. There's a few other buildings where they're doing like a metal strip to stop some of the concrete cracks that develop and that water intrusion, which is becoming an issue. Are you building differently now? I mean, one of the things that we notice is this new generation of product is aesthetically being sold very differently to a much, much higher level. So the kitchens are much better, the bathrooms are much better, the finishes are much better, the doors are much better. What about the actual, like, what we can't see? Is there a difference in building today from, say, 10 years ago at all, or is it still the same?
Yes, 100%. And again, this goes in the bucket of learnings, right? Where with different climates, evolving climate that we have here, more and more events, we're all trying to adapt to that. Again, that starts literally at the foundation and goes all the way up through the building. The slope of your balconies, maybe the differential between your balcony, floor height to your interior height, making sure you have a difference there, right? Because sliding glass doors have to slide. Therefore, there's going to be an air gap, and therefore water can get in, right?
Yeah.
It's just
that's one of the big things that happen. Lots of old buildings where water would get in, especially during a hurricane, because the water's being pushed up against. Yeah, and then it kind of gets in, intrudes, and starts lifting your floor up. Yeah. I've seen a few mechanics where they're like building different types of door frames now on the exterior to the terrace. I think Vita did something different with this special lip system where you no longer have a threshold because they have this system sunken into the concrete. Yes. Is the actual materials being used, is it the same or is that changing?
Yeah, different. You have different types of concrete. You have different, without getting too many in the details here, but there's different types of concrete with different pressures, different components in those, how fast they harden. The aggregate that goes in those can nowadays is stronger, right? You can have more pressure. That of course comes with a cost, and the more sort of setbacks you have and differences in floors, the more complicated the construction gets. Because when you're pouring concrete, you have to shore and basically plan for what's going to be there in that finished product. Right. So whether that's a slope or whether that's a drain, whether that's a shaft coming through that concrete, all that stuff is getting planned ahead of time. Yeah. There are tools that help us do that faster today than we used to. But at a high level, if you look at construction and you look at real estate, right, many studies have shown that over the last 50 years, productivity has actually been 0% increase. Right. It's been flat. So with all the technology, with everything we're doing, we're actually not more productive. Most industries have gone up 5x, 10x, right, over the last 50 years. So you look at the Empire State Building. That was built in just over a year, I think, right? I don't know what it would take.
It was built over a year. I didn't know that. The Empire State Building took over a year.
Today,
how the hell did they do that?
Right? Easily 5 years to build that. So right, you think about construction and think of the details, the stonework, right, the quality, the craftsmanship. So yes, while we are doing things that are more complicated and more technological, there are certain things we have not progressed. In many ways, I'd say we've regressed on, right, on some of those finishes and details.
How do you regress? I mean, like, is it just cutting corners?
I think there's some of that. I think there's efficiencies that we're all looking for. I think part of that is regulations, right? There used to be a lot more deaths and injuries on job sites. Right, we've all seen the sort of iconic pictures of people hanging on these I-beams floating around.
I've got a little statue of a beam. It's that Empire with the 12 guys all sitting there eating their lunch, and they've got no harnesses on whatsoever. They're just sitting there like thousands of feet above the ground, just eating a sandwich.
Right, we all have that visual, so it's a lot different today, right? So that these things come with a cost, but that's good for humanity and society. That you're son, daughter, whoever goes to work, they're going to come home, right? And that's safety is number one for us, right? So that is very important. So regulations have affected that, but there's less of an emphasis on the trades, right? This is just sort of a macro comment about society, but historically, people would grow up and want to be an artisan and carpenter and have sort of a real skill to work with their hands. And you don't see that as much today. And there used to be more unions. They had much more training.
Yeah, I wanted to get into the labor conversation. Let's just jump into that rabbit hole, because labor is typically, and we had comments off camera. I knew a Chicago builder who came in, and he tried 1 year building down here in South Florida a house, just a house, not a condo, just one house. And he said, this is a totally different ball game. This is not easy. We don't have unions down here in South Florida, you were saying. So how do you get round this labor challenge that we've got? Because again, labor shortages exist in the construction game. Are you seeing that? Would you have enough labor?
100%. And there's been quite a few contractors that have come down from other parts of the world, or certainly the United States, and come to South Florida and say, "Oh, I'm going to come build here." It's the same thing. It's not. It's a totally different ball game. And in fact, a lot of those companies have gone out of business because it's a very different workforce, and you're managing a very different personality here. Not to mention, the language barriers and cultural differences, but it's just a different mindset here. Labor is tight everywhere. There's no doubt. Places like South Florida, though, where there's so much construction happening from basically I-4 corridor south, right? There's just record amounts of construction. And then you add in hurricanes and storms where the labor force is getting pulled to maybe go do 2x, 3x their rate. What do you think they're going to do, right? Of course they're going to go make money. So
when there's a storm, sorry, my brain's pinging all over the place. When there's a storm, that labor that might be initially utilized for construction gets a call from, I don't know, whoever, I guess a government party, and says, we need people to get over here to repair this bridge or to rebuild this west coast of Florida, and off they run because the money's there.
Yeah, hurricanes can be very detrimental for a construction job.
And they don't have to hit the city. They could hit a city in another place. And that,
of course, right? And then the labor's needed somewhere, so they'll rush over and make, a year's salary in a few months, right? So the labor force is very tight here, and you see it sort of ebb and flow. What's especially tight is the skilled labor force. Yeah. So these high-end jobs that are being built right now in South Florida, it's sort of a record pace, right? We're seeing record numbers for pre-sales and construction and really all happening at once. It's sort of a whole new wave now of expectations, as you alluded to earlier, is really putting a strain on the labor market. And we saw a surge in material prices right after COVID. Yeah. That's more or less been settled. But now we're seeing labor getting pulled in different directions. So not even getting into politics, what could happen there. Yeah. But we've got our work cut out for us.
The demand is absolutely there for the product. And obviously the developers will say, well, I've got a demand here. There's a whole new migration of people. And there's a movement towards, and it was coined, I think, I don't know if it was coined by him, but David Martin certainly made a statement a number of times, the vertical living. And it's like the house in the sky. And the more I sell, the more I see that the most robust market, the market that people want, the product that people want, because houses have got very, very expensive. I mean, just look at the cost of living in homes. I think that's why the luxury condo sales have gone up so much. Everyone wants a house in the sky. And that's a lot more difficult than just building a 1,000 square foot apartment that you can then rent out to some students who want to live in Brickell. That used to be the case, 2010 to 2015, but now it's a whole other. And there's some, I don't say illusions of grandeur, but there's the bar's really set high. How do you work with the labor? How does that happen? Is it a case that things are just going to take longer? It's just going to take longer to get done?
It's an understanding with the owners, right, from the very beginning, that if you want a certain level of finish, this is the budget and the time it's going to take, and here's the handful of subs that can actually deliver it, right? There are times where certain folks are sort of demanding you work with a certain trade group or organization that they may know that has never done it before, but maybe did their home, right? And it's such a big difference going from a home or a small condo to one of these massive 300, 400 unit buildings with a lot going on at once, right? Just the logistics of that are very complicated. So people often will look at, say, the surf club and set the bar there. If you were to build,
surf club's a good example, because let's take an example of a successful project, and obviously thinking of how that happens, because the reason I wanted to do this podcast was because Coastal has a stellar reputation. There's a couple of big players in the market, 2 as far as I can think of, but you're one of them. And then there are a lot of others, and examples of projects that weren't done well that are now in litigation were, and I heard people approached you and said, okay, we want to hire you, and said, okay, here's the quote, and they're like, that's too expensive, and they toddle and find someone cheaper, and then you can imagine what happens. It's like hiring the cheap GC in the house. He's like, I can do that for 25% of the cost, and you're hired. The cheap becomes expensive. You're going to pay for it. With your business as it is today, like how do you with the Surfside, how did that work? Like, talk us through that. Why was that such a successful project in your mind? Did you see that happening? Did you think it was going to be super successful?
A great example really to dive into. Number one was a great team, all the way around, from the developer to the design team to the team that we had. It was really one of the more complicated construction jobs we've done as well. A lot of people don't realize, there's a historical building there that had to be protected, had to be reinforced from below, right? Parking below there was shored up to make sure that historical building didn't move. The glass that is so sort of iconic on that building had to be tested and installed in a special manner so it worked in this environment. The building to the south there, the condo, it spans, I forgot exactly, don't quote me, 50, 75 feet or something out over the historical building. And if you're sort of standing in the lobby and you look up, you can see it. That building is actually structurally hung from the top down. And that's why there's no columns there, and that's how you get that great aesthetic. There's a core, basically, shaft that goes up the building and then hangs the floors from the top, basically. So imagine you're building it almost in reverse, right, if that makes sense. So building that is, again, one of a kind, never been done. And so the structure of that building is very complicated to begin with, protecting the historical building, the glass, the details, but then the finishes, right? And that's where it's so great to have a partnership where the owner in that particular case wanted to continue setting the bar higher and higher and have better finishes and really attention to detail.
And that was the decision of the developer. That was the development group, and they're the ones that pay you to do the job.
Yes, we do what we're told. At the end of the day, we have advice, we have recommendations, we have a history of doing things, but ultimately we're going to do what the developer wants. I mean, within legal.
Yeah, I was going to say, because there's a point where they say, let's say there was a nefarious developer who said, I need to cut corners. I don't like the fact that labor costs have gone up, time constraints are putting a pressure on me, but I still want to make the same amount of money. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a case of, no, you can't do that. Because I've seen, I think some of the projects that haven't done well is because value engineering has become a thing. No contracts, I've never had anyone, interestingly, have come to me and saying, I want to know what type of concrete are they pouring into that building. Like, that's never a question that comes up. Right. Maybe it should be.
Yeah. During construction, right, there are core samples. And I don't actually know if this is public or not, I should know, but the county and city, depending where you're building, is taking core samples of concrete. They're testing it. The concrete company themselves is taking samples to look at it. You were talking earlier about water intrusion, making sure the edges, maybe they're metal, or you paying a little bit more attention to those edges of buildings to make sure that salt water doesn't penetrate the concrete. To get to the rebar, that creates the spalding, right, where the rebar starts to expand and crack the concrete, right? That's, this whole... what we've seen after that,
the Champlain Tower collapse. Well, that was one of my. That was you're perfectly leading into that, one of those questions. But keep going, because I want to then come back to that.
Mm-hmm. I forgot where I was going with that.
With the way it was being built, that all those the influence of the forces of nature,
and that dance with the ownership and the construction team of value engineering in many ways is good, and a lot of that has to do with the design of a building, right? Just macro changes of things where shear walls and transfer slabs and certain structural elements that we know are very expensive and time consuming, maybe we can design away from that. But that doesn't mean cutting corners for quality once the actual structure and the building is designed, right? And that's the difference, right? You're not trying to cut corners so that the end user has an inferior experience. It's really the upfront value engineering where you can save a lot of money and time.
Is it possible to like list things? Like if someone came to you and said, all right, these are the questions you need to have that we're going to do, like the rebar and all these elements coming into it. Because I know from a buyer's point of view, buyers always ask me when they're looking into a building, we start off with like, okay, who's the developer? And I always say to them, yeah, the developer's great, it's good to look into them, but when's the last time you asked who the builder is? The builder's so important because the architect comes up with a design. Okay, it always looks amazing. It's creative. It's wonderful. It's like coming up with the idea for a flying car. But then you've got to have someone who builds the damn thing. And it's like, it's one thing to say, build me a flying car. It's another thing to say, build me a flying car with 8th graders.
Right.
It's like...
Yeah. It's true. And it's all important, right? You can have... If you have one weak link, it can really throw things off. If you have one bad engineer or architect or developer or builder, right? Like one thing can really mess it up. It's sort of organized chaos, right? I mean, and so you have to have this sort of dance has to really come together. And we've had great design teams, great subs, great teams, but maybe an owner that was pushing really hard to cut corners and thin things out sort of at the end on the finishes. Maybe it's a closet detail. Maybe it's cabinets. Yeah. Maybe you're saying, but what do your buyers see? They come in, they're not looking at the concrete. They're looking at the cabinets.
They're just looking inside the
doors
unit
and say, hey, these are hollow doors. That's not what I paid for. We get blamed for that. That's not our fault, right? That's what we were told to do.
But
right?
that's the developer's decision and the ethics of, I want to stand by a product that I can be proud of. Because this is not my last rodeo. I've got more buildings to build. But if I build this shoddy one, then everything after, everyone's going to keep referencing that badly done building. Right. You're literally only as good as your last project.
Right.
And I think this is one of the things that, we see a lot of developers coming into Miami for the first time, new developers wanting to build because they see the demand in the market, they see the appetite. But we also know through every cycle there are projects that just never make it off the ground. They never get built because either they're just too ambitious or they don't have the right team. Are there examples when you've met with developers and you're like, nah, I'm sorry, pass? Does that, I imagine that
There's probably
happens.
more of that than the alternative, actually.
So you probably take on...
We say no probably to more work than we say yes to.
Okay.
Probably by a pretty big margin, actually.
Really?
Yeah. And that's indicative sort of the market.
Yes.
It's indicative of our sort of focus on quality and not trying to grow too quick, right?
Yeah.
To be very... Because just like a developer, we're only as good as our last job too, right? So we have to make sure we're delivering what and when we say we are. And some of our best jobs we've had are with some of the most professional developers that know what they're doing, have done it 100 times before, right? And it's a formula, right? That's some of the best relationships. We have some great relationships with some folks that are getting into the business too, but are willing to learn. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes there's people from totally different industries that want to become developers, and it can be tricky, right? Because they want to apply maybe something from their industry to construction, and it's not always the same, right? I mean, construction and real estate and development in South Florida it is unique.
Without a doubt. And because it's unique, I mean, I want to get into sustainability and climate resilience, and then I want to get into the politics, because the politics for me is a big conversation. Right. So, with the fact that we have, a climate to deal with, and we have increased amounts of storms and hurricanes happening, is the construction process for that, the preparation for buildings to be resilient, because HOA fees have been rising, insurance costs have been going up. I'm now seeing some developers and builders coming in saying, okay, we're taking these countermeasures to make our building particularly resilient to storms and just general, the effects of nature and rain and weather and storms and climate and stuff. What's going on right now for that? Is there a big change in construction for that, or is it has it changed at all in the last 10 years?
There's definitely more awareness. There's more conversation around it. I would say, generally speaking, the regulatory environment has probably not kept up with the changing climate, right? And therefore, the codes and standards haven't necessarily changed. But what we just saw recently, where you have a tropical storm become a Category 5 in 18 hours in the Gulf of Mexico is unheard of, right? I mean, my lifetime, never seen that. Back-to-back Category 5s in the Gulf so late in the year. So we're seeing stronger storms form much faster. And, we've been blessed here in the East Coast not to have a devastating storm for some time now. And who knows what would happen if one of these Category 5, extreme storms hit, a downtown area. I mean, I can't imagine from the insurance standpoint and everything that would happen. So, it's a tough question to know if you're really ready for it. You probably don't know exactly until it happens, God forbid. But I would say the new buildings that are being built, right, and every year we are learning, we are using, as I mentioned, taking into account foundations and parking garages and pumps and windows.
Yeah, I'm thinking about getting rid of the water, because one of the things that we've seen with the storms is the rising sea level. Water level. And obviously water coming up through the drains. And there's got to be what are the measures? Because again, with all these buildings around, the measures being taken to get this water out, to get it so it doesn't leave 8,
you don't want
9
standing water.
To be in that position where it just goes. And does it help the fact that we're on the bedrock is limestone? Are we seeing better, drainage of that water coming out? Like, what are the things that you've got to be aware of topographically within certain areas of the city that would say, this area is going to flood more than, because there's certain areas flood more than others, for sure. I mean, it can go into the Coral Gables area and find no water during a storm, and another part of town can be in a part of Brickell, and there's flooding.
There's a ridge, right, that runs through South Florida. And there are parts of that get 15 plus feet high on that ridge, and that is for sure some of the best places to be building. But since we live on limestone, it's a sponge, right? Think about it as a sponge, and if you put your sponge in your sink full of water, as that water fills up, so does the sponge. And if you start putting water on top of it, it doesn't have anywhere to go, right? Because there's water right below it.
Yes.
So the draining system becomes very complicated when we are a foot or two above sea level. Then you have a king tide situation, right? And or a storm surge. And now that sponge is now completely underwater, and there's literally nowhere for the water to go. So if you're lucky enough to be on the ridge and it's 15, 20 feet high, sure, you're above it, you're at the high part, that's great. But there are parts of our community that are going to continue to really struggle to address this. And there's wells, you can pump the water below, into the aquifer, but it's really hard to keep up with that, right? And it's something that does scare me quite a bit, because you can start to raise new buildings and homes and build it up.
Yeah, we've seen that. We've seen homes in Miami Beach. My wife builds houses, and she would have a seawall that's like 15 feet higher than the neighboring seawall, and there people are building their houses. And the code for Miami Beach single-family homes has been changing. You see builders actually saying, I'm going to kind of predict the next change, so I'm going to be I'm not going to be the minimum requirement above. I'm going to be well above that, so I'm going to meet to code 20 years from now. Right. And people want to live they want to live on the water. There's a reality about living and waking up in the morning and looking at the ocean. So that's kind of like an impossible thing to avoid in a conversation where people say, well, or I just live out of the flood zone. If those houses or those condos, which are the ones what keeps you awake at night? And when you look in areas, what's the thing that
the infrastructure
struggle with?
Right, the infrastructure. A lot of things, whether it's the actual roads. It's one thing to raise a new house or a new condo, but if you can't get to your house, right?
Well, that's the thing is, otherwise you're a castle with a moat around you,
right? And you can't get to work maybe, or roads are blocked or salt water. That starts to become a real challenge. Then think about what's under the road, right? Your sewage pipes, right? Your fiber optics, right? The water, all of this that's underground that we're not seeing is now in the salt water. It wasn't designed for that. So now all of a sudden you're going to have a lot more sort of major failures in these things. We've had a major sewage leak in South Florida, right? We've been fined by the federal government for years, billions and billions of dollars because of major sewage leaks here. This is happening, sort of beneath our eyes. And as climate change continues to get worse, it's something that's going to have to be addressed. I don't think we're going to give up on Miami. We're not just going to walk away.
Well, you also have to give up on the entire Eastern Seaboard, because it's not just Miami.
It's not just
it's
here.
New York. I mean, Asheville just got whacked. Who would have imagined that?
Who would have thought?
And so almost anybody who's on the East, what, you're going to wipe out the entire Eastern Seaboard?
Yeah, I mean, you've got fires, right? You've got
the
flooding,
West Coast has fires and earthquakes.
Snow, you've got droughts, right? I mean, there's
Global,
tornadoes.
global is the key in global in climate change.
We have our acute issues to deal with, and other places have their issues. There's no escaping this. This is, we're in this together. But I think, and I hope leaders from the federal, state, and local level address it head on and start to address this infrastructure, right? And make sure it's a community that's livable for everybody, not just the top 1% or something, right? That everyone can afford to live here, whether that's the cost of insurance for your car, for your house, right? To make sure people can actually afford to buy that first home and build equity and not be stuck renting, right? These are things we got to address.
This segues into the whole political conversation. And there's two sides of this conversation that when I think of the politics of South Florida and how we're maintaining. In fact, there's three. You mentioned on one, the infrastructure. Like, we will have more traffic, population's growing, 1,000 people a day, and obviously with the introduction of all these new corporate offices, Citadel coming and all these other companies, population growth. Are we, in your opinion, prepared and to handle the population, given the fact that you can go into I-95 now and you see constant construction going on, better road systems. We don't have a subway system for obvious reasons. There's public transport is still so-so. Yep. Most people travel around by car, and that's why our freeways are getting really busy. We've got issues with construction, commercial space, schools is becoming an issue. Do you think, as you're in the construction business, that we are going to be adequately prepared for 2030, or do you think there needs to be some changes at a state level in order to encourage more emphasis on developing this infrastructure? Will our infrastructure handle what's coming?
Great question, and it's always hard to plan for the growth that we've had. There are some great projects happening, right? You mentioned the interstates and some of the expansion efforts, some of the bridges that will help. But it's deeper than that, right? It's workforce housing, it's schools, it's everything that has to do with infrastructure. So do we need more? Yes, 100% we need more. Do we need more funding? 100% we need more. Do people want to pay more taxes? No, right? So at a certain point, it's a give and take relationship. What I've started to notice, I'm sure you have too, is Miami's becoming a more mature city, of course, but when you're in places like LA or New York, if you're from a certain part of an area, you kind of stay there, right? If you live in South Miami, your kids probably go to school in South Miami, you probably go to dinner in South Miami. You really don't want to go to Wynwood or Design District. And vice versa. If you live on the beach, you're probably not going to go to Coral Gables that often or Coconut Grove, right? You kind of live and work, and we're becoming more sort of segregated in our communities for where your kids go to school, where you eat, et cetera, because the traffic is just so hard to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Ponce Davis down the street, and my kids go to a local school here in basically a school called St. Thomas. And a lot of our life revolves around, being here. However, Miami's not a particularly big city. It's not like Chicago or New York or, LA. I go to LA and I have to get across from West Hollywood to Brentwood to Beverly Hills, and I'm like, my God, it's going to take me all day. Here, after this, I have a meeting and I have to go to the beach, and I'm gonna bounce from Brickell to downtown to the beach and maybe even to the Grove, and I'm going to do that in one day. I can do that in one day, and I might go for dinner tonight in Design District, and tomorrow I'm going to end up on the beach. So I think we can get around, but that might have to change as the population grows, because it might not take me as it used to take me. Say to my wife, let's go for dinner in South Beach tonight. Right. 20 minutes, no problem. Maybe not anymore. Another 5 years from now might be a little bit different. So being centric to the cause, obviously expansion of Brickell, that's going to become more and more relevant.
I would say generally it's somewhat predictable too with the season. in season and out of season, but also time of day, right?
Yeah.
You know, heading to downtown at rush hour is going to be bad, and vice versa, leaving downtown right in the afternoon. So, you know, I think there is some predictability to it. To your point, you're going to navigate your day probably around those traffic considerations, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to go to downtown at 8 a.m., right?
Yeah.
From here. So.
Champlain Tower collapse. The condo that killed around 100 people, that collapsed a few years ago now. Absolute tragedy. Yep. The rebar crumbled, the columns went, and the entire building came down. Absolute tragedy. There is obviously now new laws in place and coming into the political arena. How are we, from a construction process, because I realize that's your business, from a construction process, are some of these, I mean, a good number of these buildings, are they redeemable? Can we repair them? Or is it going to be time to just let them go and they're going to have to be demoed? And do you see, just your observations, do you see a lot of buildings that are going to have to come down? Or do you think it's not that bad?
I don't mean to be political, but I do think it's going to be case by case, right? And I think a lot of that is going to have to do with, number one, how it was built, and then number two, the actual maintenance of those buildings over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Have they really been maintained? And what's happening around them, right? The surrounding environment is important. Is there a lot of construction happening, you know, adjacent to these buildings?
Yeah.
And what's the actual budget, right? There is just a certain reality of these condo boards with a lot of folks on a fixed income that it's going to be very difficult, right, to handle these assessments, to bring these buildings back to a place that is, you know, structurally sound. And so I think you're taking into account all these considerations in assessing each of these buildings. Can it be done? I think in most cases, yes. Is there the money there for it? You know, case by case.
Is there anything physically that you would observe as, you know, one of the biggest construction groups out there, that you could walk past a building saying, okay, pay attention to these things? Are there things that you can physically see, or is it not that easy? Is it far more complicated than that from an engineering perspective?
Generally, it's more complicated. I would say there are certain structural parts of a building that are integral to its sustainability, right?
Which is like, give me there's.
So I mentioned earlier transfer slabs, for example. These are slabs that are basically moving a lot of weight from one place to another down into the foundation of the building, and these transfer slabs are carrying a lot of weight above them. If there's a critical crack,
is a transfer slab like a support beam?
Like a support beam. Yeah, it's like a super support beam, basically. Okay. And if there's a crack or some structural problem there, real weakness, that could have catastrophic effects. There are certain, of course, all columns are critical, but there are certain columns that might be more critical to the function of a building than others, making sure that they are supported properly, right? That's critical. The foundations of 30 or 40 years ago are actually different than today, right? We talked about those piles today going down 150, 200 feet. They didn't used to do that, right, typically. In South Florida. So it was a different sort of friction.
Does that mean
system.
that the newer buildings, there's like no chance of the newer buildings coming down, like buildings built from the last 20 years? Yeah. Is that just an impossibility, or is it still, it can still happen? It's not done right.
Look, I think generally speaking, the newer buildings have different set of standards, have often, we talked about the level of concrete and the piles and the structure, the window systems, right, are all just generally better systems. But that's nothing against some of the older buildings were well built. It's really a case by case basis. Yeah.
We're actually trying to do a study on that because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because I think there are some older buildings that are still very, very good. Mm-hmm. And I know there's the assumption that the buildings are bad. In terms of politics, and this is really the last thing, which is obviously what we're kind of touching on, but you know, you were in Congress, you sat on the current government's Export Council. The impact that you see, and again, we have the election next week. What do you foresee as the impact of the election outcome on the Miami real estate market and construction? Is there an impact at that level on what happens at a local level when it comes to do with real estate construction?
No doubt. And there's so many impacts of this election, and everyone said it, and I would agree this is perhaps the most important election of our lifetime. There are two candidates with very different philosophies for the future of America. Specific to your question, how it affects Miami real estate, number one, I would say infrastructure. You have one candidate that doesn't really believe in climate change and isn't acknowledging it. Hard to see the funding coming from that candidate or party to address climate change that is so critical for South Florida. So that's number one most important thing. If we're not addressing our critical infrastructure to address climate change, we're going to have some real issues ahead. So that's number one. Number two, immigration. Right? We all talk about it, and there's really a twofold component of this. Number one, a lot of our buyers, as you know better than me, are foreign. Right? Are they going to be able to get into this country and invest in our local real estate?
Less right now, but I mean, again, 2010 to 2015, yes, lots of foreign nationals coming in from all over the world. Obviously, right now we've got a lot of Californians and New Yorkers, but yes, Miami is a global city, like Dubai, like Singapore, like London.
Right. And it's part of what makes Miami so unique, right? It's so eclectic. Yep. They say at any given time there's like 110 languages being spoken in Miami, right? That's beautiful. I love that about our community. But then the other side of that is the workforce, right, that we alluded to earlier.
Yes.
Whether it's the hospitality, agriculture, construction industry, these are directly impacted with immigration policies. Those are some issues that should definitely be thought through, when voting, if you care about South Florida real estate and how it's going to impact us. Because, look, politics has an impact on all of our lives.
For sure. How do you, and again, one of the last questions, how do you see an improvement for the labor force? Is there any solution to improve the labor force to get the quality of construction that clearly we're promoting and marketing out there in the public eye? Yeah,
it's a great question. We're constantly trying to promote and push apprenticeship and mentorship programs to try to train some of the younger folks, getting and working with our subcontractors to do the same. South Florida is very transient, so you have a workforce that's sort of in and out here constantly. To the extent that we can make this community more livable for everybody, including that workforce, I believe you will have a better workforce, because they're not going to move to the next community where the next job is and the next and the next. If they can live here and work here and put their kids in school here and afford it and have a good quality of life, then they're going to continue to grow and prosper in this community, and they might teach their kids certain skills, and they're going to continue to grow in their own skill set. So that's part of, I think, what's plagued this community. In 2007, 2008, we had this big run up, all this real estate, it collapsed. A lot of those workers left. Now they come back, right? It's this up and down. So to the extent we can flatten that and make it more predictable, that'll improve the workforce as well.
Beautiful. I mean, I could go on asking you like 1,000 questions. I know we've got limited time here. Obviously, government regulations. Do we have stringent enough regulations on construction now? Laws being passed down from the government, do they understand the requirements so that developers are forced to build at a certain level, a certain quality, to build buildings that will maintain themselves for the next 15, 20 years? Do we need more change, or are we good?
Yeah, great question. In my experience in government, the regulatory environment is usually looking in the review mirror, right? It's usually retroactive, right? After Enron and WorldCom collapsed, you saw Sarbanes-Oxley, right? You saw Dodd-Frank after 2008, right? You saw a bunch of new rules at the state level, Senate Bill 4D after Champlain Tower collapsed. So right, wrong, indifferent, this is a whole day's conversation on the regulatory environment, but typically it's after something happens, we act. That doesn't mean politicians aren't talking about it. It doesn't mean they don't know what's happening, but the strain on the system is so much. There's only so many things you can get done to get everyone to coalesce, Republicans and Democrats and everyone to come together at the right time on a bill is really difficult. And so often it does happen when everyone's calling for it. So is it there? Probably not, right? There's some things we could do that are being discussed that would be better proactively, and to bring the private sector into that conversation, for sure, that would be better. Unfortunately, that's usually not the way our government works. And I'm not for more regulation, I'm for smarter regulation, right? Yeah. I actually think we could remove a lot of the antiquated regulations we have, and let's look at today's world and what's really affecting us, and be smarter with it. But I was always surprised in DC, being in Congress, how much pressure there is to basically just keep things the way it is. Right? Don't touch it. Don't upset the apple cart, so to speak. Right? I always thought it was, hey, let's make things better. Let's make it more efficient. Right? I'm private sector driven and capitalistic. Right? Let's just get for efficiency. It's not the case in government.
So I don't want to leave on a negative note. So I want to keep on a positive note. Let's finish on a positive note. What are you excited about? Like projects that you're doing right now that are coming out of the ground that you're developing that you go, you know what? I'm looking forward to seeing this come to fruition. What are you positive? What are you bullish about? I mean, I always ask people what keeps them awake at night, but what are you excited about with Miami moving forward over the next 5 years? Any projects that you're doing that you're like, let's check out that one, pay attention to that one, especially for our viewers who are, especially buyers who are always asking me like, what should I be looking at? What are you building right now that you're particularly excited about?
So we're blessed to have probably the biggest backlog in our country's company's history. So many great jobs. It'd be hard for me to single any one out. I would say generally they all have much more attention to detail and quality, which is just going to elevate our real estate market. So I love that. Some great commercial projects that have big tenants in it. Those big tenants are going to bring jobs, going to bring money to our community, more real estate. That's awesome, right? To see these real jobs, but also geographically diversified, right? We're building a ton of really high quality stuff over in Naples, right? The west coast of Florida was traditionally more sleepy. Some really high end stuff going up there in St. Pete, Tampa, right? So it's not just Miami and Palm Beach, right? It's the whole state we're really seeing. In Jacksonville, some big jobs. So I would say all of that excites me. Do we have things we could do better with? Yeah, sure. More public transportation, of course, but as a community, I'm very bullish on South Florida and excited about the future.
Well, like someone with all good family and paternal instincts, you love all your children. I can clearly see that. Yeah. If you want to know, obviously, more about coastal projects, go on their website. You can see what's going on. Or better yet, pick up the phone and give me a call and I'll talk to you about it. And obviously, we'll walk you through my opinion of what I'm excited to see coming out through the ground over the next 5 years as this city moves forward. And I guess we're all here part of this same community. We want to see it evolve and do well. I think these conversations are super valuable. I really appreciate your candor. I know that some of these questions aren't easy questions to answer. This is just the reality, but I think these are valuable. They help people make what we always say is better decisions, because this is what the podcast is titled. Patrick, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I learned a lot today, and I hope you did too. So thank you for watching the Better Decisions podcast. Stay tuned for another episode coming soon.